All right, well, yeah, why don't we go ahead and get started, run a little bit ahead of schedule. So as Ron mentioned, I'm Eric Malm. I've been involved in the Cloud Foundry community since about 2013, when I started at what was then Pivotal, then continued with the acquisition to VMware. And as we'll see, I was one of the members of the first Technical Oversight Committee that we formed sometime last year, after the first election in the new governance structure. And before that, I served in the previous model of technical governance on the project management committees, largely in the app runtime area. So I'll go ahead and get started. Actually, I'll go ahead and take off my mask, too, for the time being. So in terms of what I plan to cover today, I thought I'd do a quick overview of what we used to have in terms of technical governance within the Cloud Foundry Foundation. So this is the project-based and PMC-based model that started in 2015 and then continued into 2020. And that's when we had our big governance refresh in terms of reformulating how we wanted all of the governance of the technical assets and roadmaps in the community to work. So I'll highlight the roles and the structures that we set up with that. And then I'll talk about the RFC process that we established last year, which really gives us a process to change the process within the community, and highlight some examples from that. And I'll conclude by talking about some next steps where we see all this going now that it's been established over the last year or so. Okay, so here's what we started out with when, in terms of technical governance, when we formed the Cloud Foundry Foundation in 2015. And at the time, we had Pivotal as the main sponsor for the development of Cloud Foundry. And so we really looked to the very productive development model that we had within Pivotal teams at the time and tried to kind of come up with an abstraction of that we could put into the model for the community to operate. So that model really revolved around the notion of having a product that you're developing on these teams, and then the development team itself. And so this got translated into the notion of a project, and then the corresponding project team that was working on that. And again, even here, the expectation was that this is a pretty dedicated set of individuals working on this part of the community contributions. So of course, they had a development backlog in the Pivotal model, and generally adhered to XP practices, like pair programming, a lot of test-driven development. And so those were also reflected in the governance structure around each one of these individual projects. So there's the expectation of having a public backlog, and then generally the major model was that contributors to that would be pairing most of the time with each other working on that particular project in the community. Then there are a couple of distinguished roles on those Pivotal development teams, primarily the project manager, who is making prioritization decisions about that backlog, and then the anchor, who is providing the technical leadership on the team. And so those got translated into the notion of the project lead and the technical lead for each one of these projects. So this is how the model got translated in the small. And then all of these projects were organized into what we called project management committees. So these had their own life cycle over the 5 years or so in this model. But by the end of this, we ended up with, I think, a total of 5. So we had the runtime one, which was managing the bulk of the components around the Cloud Foundry app runtime, as we ended up calling it at that point in time. So as you might expect, this is a huge set of projects to be managing. You know, we had all of Cappy, we had all of Diego, we had Garden and networking, logging metrics. Eventually moved the CLI and things like MySQL, and then the Irene project and UAA into this group. So this is a very large set of projects to be managing in one part of the organization. Bosch is also pretty big, not quite as big, but we had some different Bosch teams working on the core, working on stem cells, and then different teams working or being responsible for the different CPIs that interacted with the IaaSes. Contrast that with the Open Service Broker API project, which was really just atomic, its own little universe on its own. And then we had another very large area called extensions that effectively just became kind of the catch-all drawer for all the other projects in the community if they didn't neatly align to the core of the app runtime, which was already too big, or to the Bosch project. So we had a lot of great things in there, like CredHub and Build Packs and Autoscaler and Service Fabric. But again, there was really no cohesion there. It was just kind of things that don't fit elsewhere. And then in the last few years of this model, we ended up introducing the Pacato projects and the set of cloud native build packs that they're developing. So this is really where we stood in 2020. And at that point, a lot of the defects of this model were beginning to become kind of untenable in the community. So kind of three main problems that we were seeing with this model. So it's pretty exclusive to the folks that were deep in the trenches working on that. It was very hard to tell from the outside what was even going on with the projects. And there was a lot of fragmentation in terms of tracking where everything was. So some examples of how this was really kind of an exclusive community just for the contributors. A lot of teams tended still to use Pivotal Tracker for managing those project backlogs. And we got a lot of feedback over the years that if you didn't have a good level of access to that particular project, it was basically impossible to track what was going on there. And the Tracker product team wasn't particularly interested in adding features to Tracker to make that any easier for the community, because again, it was a commercial product, and it was really designed to support that Pivotal style development model. And then the pairing expectations on most of these projects ended up making it very difficult for a casual or part-time contributor to come in and make any significant progress on development and to really get involved with the team. Kind of had to be dedicated to it and go through often the dojo process to get integrated into the team, and then you were dedicated to that project. And because of that, there's really not even a good pathway, let alone a documented one, to get any kind of contributor rights from outside of that team. This also led to a lot of inconsistent team structure within the GitHub organizations themselves. So we tended to just create teams ad hoc. We had a lot of back channels to create teams if certain people needed access to assets. So again, not very inclusive to the entire community. And then this level of opacity really led to the same problems for understanding what was going on with decisions around these projects. In part because the project leads had a lot of autonomy under the governance model, there tended to be little accountability for the decisions they were making, little discussion about their prioritization in the community, and a few records of what was actually going on. And then there was a lot of fragmentation. Like we already see that in the PMC structure. There were these two obvious nexuses around the app runtime and around Bosch, but other than that, there wasn't a lot of good coherent organization of these projects within this model. There's also continual confusion about the kind of promotion process through the project maturity. So we had this notion of an incubating project within the community, and everyone always assumed that that meant experimental, when technically it didn't mean that. So experimental things got put into there when they could still have been put into kind of the main active projects and just marked as experimental. And so we also ended up with all these repositories strewn across a bunch of different GitHub organizations. There were three main ones, the main Cloud Foundry organization. We had one for these incubating projects that we then needed to promote into the main org if they came out of incubation. And then we had the attic for anything that we needed to retire. And some of these things were natural patterns to pursue given the level of sophistication that we had with GitHub at the time. So for example, we didn't have a notion of archiving a repository then, so the attic was a reasonable construction at that point, as a place to say, like, this is frozen for the foreseeable future. But then we also ended up with a lot of shadow organizations around these teams because they often would find that that was the easiest pathway to go through to get access to the assets or privileges they needed to have. So we really hit kind of a breaking point in 2020 in terms of the community organization. So we figured out we really need to make a change to how this model is working because we're seeing more successful models in other communities. So starting around September of 2020, we formed a small task force within the community. So we had representatives from the CFF and then from each of the four major member companies in the foundation at the time. And they started to get to work on what is now the community repo in the Cloud Foundry GitHub org. So for the first month or two of that, there was some assessment of what the models are in our peer communities, like Kubernetes and Knative and Istio and the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and other foundations. And as a result of that assessment, it looked like Knative and similar organizational structures with a Technical Oversight Committee and working groups would be the model that would best fit the set of assets and practices that we had in the Cloud Foundry Foundation. So over the next 4 months or so, that task force worked on revising that initial starting point with the Knative governance model and shaping it into what we thought would be appropriate for the Cloud Foundry community. So that largely stabilized in March. Took a couple more months to get that approved by the governing board and actually applied into the Cloud Foundry Foundation charter, But that was done by May, and so now we were all cleared to kick off the formation of that first Technical Oversight Committee. So that initial election for the Bootstrap Committee started in May. That election process generally lasts a month, so it ended in June, and that's when we started that first term of the Technical Oversight Committee under the new model. Yeah.
Virtual attendees have noted that as of right now, they can only see your left elbow.
Oh, okay. All right. So I'll move over here a bit. Great. So one thing I wanted to point out, as a result of the reformulation of this governance, we landed on a few core principles that we wanted to pursue in the new governance model. And they're really reflecting those defects that we'd seen in the previous model. So we wanted to make sure that there was adequate transparency about what was actually going on in the community. So making sure that community members as a whole can find past records of decisions, they can understand where to come into the community to participate as those decisions are being made, and that they can also understand the future roadmaps and where those decision points are coming in. And then similarly, having enough clarity around the process in the community. So even knowing what all the organizations are, where everything is, getting more complete visibility into where all the assets for the community are and what feeds into what. And then finally, making sure that we've got a sufficiently inclusive community here. So again, we had these big barriers to entry to contribution on most of the project teams. And so we really wanted to fix things like that. So having a defined pathway for contributors to come in, start contributing casually, and build up their ability to contribute as they gain trust within the community themselves. And making sure that everyone is going through that same pathway to earn that level of privilege and responsibility within the community. Okay, so I wanted to illustrate kind of the hierarchy of structure that we have as a result of this model. So ultimately, all of the authority for this rests in the Cloud Foundry Governing Board. As I mentioned, that's formed by representatives of the member companies in the Cloud Foundry Foundation. So if you're at a certain level of membership status, you get to have a seat on the governing board. And they're the ones who decide really what that charter should be. And this is where we amended that charter to form the Technical Oversight Committee. So every year, we have elections now to determine a subset of seats on the committee. The size of the committee is fixed at 5 members, and there's a cap that says that any individual company can't have more than 2 members on the committee. We also set it up with staggered 2-year terms so that we'll have a natural rotation of membership on the committee. And part of its main responsibilities are to have regular public meetings and other forums for the community to come in and discuss issues that span the community, to get updates from the working groups, and otherwise to provide that level of transparency into the decision-making that they're making across the community. But of course, that TOC is not doing everything. Largely, they're going to delegate to the working groups that are really going to be managing the technical assets in the community. So one of the other major responsibilities of the TOC is to charter those working groups, to define what their scope should be, and to identify the folks that should lead that amount of scope given their past contributions within the community. And so forming that initial set of working groups was one of the major tasks that we had coming in to the results of that June election. And then those working groups themselves, they're also now supposed to have regular public meetings and roadmaps that are broadcasting and making clear what kinds of decisions they're making for the technical community. And then even within those working groups, they're typically organized into sub-areas because, as we'll see, a lot of them still have a large amount of scope to manage, and they want to similarly be able to delegate that responsibility to smaller groups of people that have the expertise in those areas. And overall, they're supposed to organize those areas and make sure that they're authorizing approvers for them appropriately. Okay, so I mentioned approvers. I think that's a good segue into the set of rules now that we have as part of this new governance model in the community. So I'd mentioned, in general, we have the notion of just being a member of the community. And we've already seen mention of the leads for the working groups. Technically, we have 2 different types of leads within this model. You can be responsible just for the technical aspects of the working group, so administering the repositories, working at the technical roadmap for that particular area of the community. And then the execution lead is really more responsible for administering just the operations of the working group. But in practice, we often see that one person will inhabit both of these roles, especially if it's a relatively small working group. And so, being a member of the community really at this point just means that you have the capability of contributing something to the Cloud Foundry technical assets. So in practice, that means that you've signed some sort of CLA agreement so that we can actually accept your contributions within the copyright model for the foundation. And then we've also had this intermediate role of being an approver, typically scoped to an area within the working groups. And again, that means that you've been a sustained contributor in that area. You're trusted there to have good judgment about what should and should not go into that code base and what kind of technical direction to take it in. And so as part of establishing these roles, we also set up responsibilities and criteria to attain these different roles. So to be an approver, you needed to have a certain number of contributions in that area that were vetted by other people that were trusted in the working group. We also had a less technical pathway through a role called the scribe. I don't think we've actually had anyone fill this role in the community, but if we have someone who's interested in eventually getting into that execution lead role, where you're coordinating activity within the working group without being as much of an expert on the technical details, then there is that intermediate role that you can go through, where you help out with those public broadcasts and discussions within the working group and make sure that they're appropriately available to the community. So this is the set of roles that we started with when we set up the original governance structure. And as we began actually applying it in practice, we found that there were some missing stages here. So as we solicited contributions from other people that weren't already approvers, we were finding that we really needed to have a defined status for being a member of the actual Cloud Foundry GitHub organization. And so we introduced this contributor role to reflect that. So it doesn't take much to attain this level of status. You just need to show a few contributions and request inclusion into the members. And then that's going to let you make pull requests and actually request that they get reviewed from the appropriate area within the community. And then the last thing that we observed is that we also needed a more defined pathway for people to be able to accumulate the kinds of reviews and other contributions that would help them become an approver in a particular area. So we introduced the notion of a reviewer role, where they would get read access to the repositories in that area so that they could be assigned reviews by other approvers and actually start building up that community credibility. So this is where we are today. I think so far this has been working out well, especially within the constraints that we have within the GitHub permissions in our organization. But of course, we'll continue to evolve it over time based on feedback from everyone here. So I wanted to point out who the people are or have been on the Technical Oversight Committee when we had that initial election. Here are the 5 people that ended up getting elected. So there was me and David Stevenson from VMware. David's back there. We also had Lee Port from the UK government PAS, a big user of Cloud Foundry. And then we had 2 representatives from SAP, Stefan Merker and Jan von Lowenstein. And as we closed out that initial year term, we knew we had to end the terms of 3 of these bootstrap individuals to make room for the next staggered set of seats on the board. So David and Lee and Jan all stepped down, and Stefan and I have continued. And then we had another election this past spring, where we introduced 3 new members. So we got Ruben, who is, I believe, I hope, attending remotely on the call. We also had Andy replacing Lee from the government UK PAS, and we had Behan stepping in from SAP. So back up to full 5 seats on the committee for this next term. And so at the end of that, Stefan and I will have our seats expire, and it'll be our decision about whether we want to continue to run for another 2-year term, or if we want to give other people the opportunity to step into this really critical role in the community. I thought I'd also illustrate the set of working groups and the corresponding areas that we ended up with as part of this organization. So I think, as we might have mentioned earlier, there's ended up being 8 of them. So we have 3 that are very closely coordinating around that app runtime. So there's the app runtime deployments working group, which primarily manages CF deployment as that main distribution of Cloud Foundry on VMs. And then we split the rest of the runtime-specific components into the interfaces working group and the platform working group. So Greg gave us a great update on the app runtime interfaces working group earlier today, and he pointed out the 8 different sub-areas that they have within that. Similarly, app runtime platform, as kind of the back end of the system, has these other 5 areas, including Diego and Garden and logging and metrics and networking. They both have their own documentation areas that are covering docs that are more aligned to one side of the runtime or the other. And then, of course, we've got CF on Kates, and we heard a lot of great things about the Karufi project earlier today, too. So these really form a more balanced distribution of that original app runtime PMC grouping that we had earlier. And then, of course, we have the foundational infrastructure working group, which Maya told us a lot of great updates about just before this. And that's where we also saw the opportunity to move some of the components that had been associated with the app runtime PMC into this more foundational area. So things that are shared across BOSH and the app runtime, like CrudHub and UAA and the databases. We thought this would be a more natural fit for that level of management. We, of course, have retained Pacato as what's now a working group, and they effectively have had their own level of autonomy that really maps onto the structure that we've already had in the rest of the working group and area model. And then we collected a lot of the service-oriented projects into the service management working group. So that includes the OSMAPI project, but also the Cloud Service Broker and Service Fabric and the volume services part of the app runtime area. And then finally, one thing that has been a little bit in the shadows in the community is that we have a lot of processes inside of the foundation for broadcasting security vulnerabilities to the member companies and making sure that they're getting handled with the appropriate level of discretion and disclosure. And so we've made that a deliberate area of contribution. Again, it's fairly small. We've really just got leads at this point that are managing that process. So these are the areas that we've reorganized the community into as a result of these governance changes. So I mentioned the RFC process, request for comments. I think we really made a nice decision here to adopt this model because it gives us a mechanism to actually definitively change the entire process for the community through a consensus-driven approach. So the idea is that there's a set of publicly available documents in the community that describe changes that we want to make to the current state of operations, either process within the community or technical decisions. So anyone can send a PR in with a draft RFC, and then if you've written that, it's then your responsibility to shepherd it through the approval process and get feedback on it and get it to advance through levels of consensus in the community. So once it's accepted, we then number them sequentially. We don't do that at the offset. So just to depict what this process is like, you write a draft RFC and submit it to the community repo, and that really starts the public discussion period. So it's then your responsibility to broadcast it, to ask the TOC to make sure that they mention it. We'll probably review it anyway if it's a PR in the community repo. And as you're going through that public discussion period, you should be taking feedback from comments on the document and any discussion in the community and amending the document to reflect that feedback. Once that settles down and we see some general consensus, then if it's scoped to a particular working group, you really just need approval from that working group itself, or if it's community-wide from the TOC, to start the final comment period. And this is now the formal ratification of the text of that RFC. So again, you might, if this is achieves the appropriate level of consensus for the community, you generally expect to see maybe just a few minor modifications that would feed back into this. And then hopefully it would get approved. If it's still too controversial, or if there are major objections during that final period for discussion, then it could get rejected. You always have the opportunity to feed that feedback back into that RFC or to start a new one if it looks like there's some flaw in it that can be corrected. Or the consensus might be like, this is something that is not appropriate for the community or that we're not ready for at this time. So in that case, you might want to hold back. And so we've had a lot of changes over the past year to the community coming through this RFC process. So one of those is the decision early on to more formally state that we want to move almost all projects to a PR-only model instead of the kind of pairing on trunk branches model that we'd had as a consequence of the original governance. So as we'd seen, there were major problems with that being not very transparent, not very inclusive. And so those problems were nicely stated even in the text for that RFC. And so the proposal was that most repositories should use only that PR workflow. So a contributor will submit a PR, there's a review process using the GitHub review system, and then an approver within that area will accept that PR and merge it in. And so this also motivated setting up branch protection rules within the GitHub system to actually enforce those constraints on these repositories. One other thing that we managed to clarify with this RFC process was how working groups would actually own and manage the repository assets within the Cloud Foundry GitHub org. So before this even, there was a push to move all of the disparate repositories from the Cloud Foundry community into that main Cloud Foundry org. We didn't have the notion of incubation anymore. I think we'll just leave things in the attic because that's just settled business as is. But also moving things in from those shadow repositories where we can. And the model that we ended up with was saying, we're gonna view the ownership of the repositories in the Cloud Foundry community as effectively a partition across the working groups. And so then it's easy to tell who needs to sign off on what proposed changes. Namely, if there's any kind of lifecycle event for a repository, the TOC should at least have a check on it. But then any affected working groups, if you're losing or adding a repository, your working group needs to sign off on that as well. So you can't be unilaterally forced to, say, accept a repository that you don't think is appropriate for your group. We also have automation now adding topics that indicate that working group ownership to each one of these repositories. So just to depict this, here's the state that we ended up with as we were doing this consolidation, just repos strewn everywhere. And now we're going to overlay this partition on them. So we've got a few of the working groups depicted here. They've now taken a subset that are non-overlapping of these repositories. Of course, the TOC is managing the community repository. I think that's the only thing that we have direct responsibility over, thank goodness. And then we've also got a set of repositories that the CFF staff administers. So for things like the certification exam, that shouldn't be public, but we need to know who owns it and is responsible for it. And then now that we've got this archival feature from GitHub, we've got a set of repositories that we've archived and that then don't have any owners. No one's responsible for them anymore. And then the last part of this is where we've explicitly got some unclaimed repositories. And the goal also of this RFC is to reduce that number down to 0 by the end of this process. So I think we're almost there, maybe nearly there. Yeah. Okay, and then to just cover one more example of how we've changed the organization and process within the community through the RFC system has been how we've formulated the teams that are associated to the working groups and the community as a whole. Again, I mentioned that there was this kind of wild west of GitHub teams that persisted for many years, especially within the Cloud Foundry org, and that gave lots of people that really shouldn't have had access to some things access because of these unregulated permission structures. So the first thing that we did is we set up a process to automatically generate GitHub teams for all of the different subsets of the working group responsibilities that we had set up already. So for area approvers, we set up teams of those approvers for each area where they would have write access to their set of repositories. We set up ones for the working group leads and the TOC where they would have admin rights over repositories. Once we added reviewers, we then gave them read permissions to those repositories in the area. And so this let people start moving into the new model and making sure that they had the permissions that were appropriate for them. The hard part then was deleting all of the old unauthorized teams. So if you joined any of the TOC discussions about this over the past few months, we ended up referring to the PR that would do this as the spicy PR. I think it was actually from Greg, and the only description was just a hot chili pepper, because this was just going to be where the rubber hits the road in terms of actually enforcing the access levels that we wanted to have in the community. So after a few false starts of automation, it turns out if you're trying to delete 80% of the teams in your GitHub org, there's a check against that in the automation tooling we're using, which is probably a good thing. And we've had a few administrative hiccups associated to this, but I think nothing that we haven't really been able to resolve. And it's also now motivating kind of the next wave of automation structure around the working groups. Okay, so I thought I'd close by just pointing out a few next steps that we have in mind for both the TOC and the working groups themselves. So within the TOC, we want to keep refining this community process, really formalizing the notion of bot accounts within working groups that we use for this automation, I think is really one of the major next steps. We've kind of started introducing those casually as part of the working group structure and the YAML that's embedded in their charters that describes all of that in a machine processable way. But there's a few loose ends that we need to resolve there around who should actually have access to manage those bot accounts. Because it's not like there's a special bot account type on GitHub, it's just another account that we've said is supposed to be used for automation. So we just need to clarify exactly what the process to manage those should be. It should really delegate, I think, to the working group leads or possibly trusted approvers in that area to manage that, because it effectively grants that level of approver permission through its level of access. We've also uncovered some places to automate those branch protection rules, again, as part of stripping away all those old legacy teams from the organization. And of course, we'd like feedback on the whole RFC process itself. I'm sure there are ways that that can be refined or made more smoother or clearer. One other area where we've seen some more interest recently is in making sure that we've got a very secure supply chain for all of the artifacts that we're producing in the CF community. So there's standards out there like SALSA that are emerging to really codify that and to provide levels of compliance. And especially with the number of sensitive and heavily regulated consumers of the CF projects, I think this is going to come up on the horizon one way or another, and we want to understand what we should be doing here. And then overall, we've been kind of taking a grassroots approach in terms of the roadmap for the community as everyone's been settling in to the new governance model. But we can probably be doing more to try and stitch all that together and provide a more coherent roadmap for the community. In terms of the working groups, I think we've seen a lot of great activity with them conforming to these new expectations for the community and incrementally moving towards the kind of open and transparent and inclusive model that we have in mind for community operations. So where we've seen public active roadmaps for the working groups, that's been great. I think there's a few areas where those could be a little bit better, but on the whole, over the past year, it's been very good. If there are opportunities to flag really good first issues for new contributors to the community, then we'd like to see more of that. And we're now really enforcing those PR-only workflows for the repositories because of all the team structures that we have made with introducing the spicy PR and clearing out all the old structure. We also want to make sure that we can provide enough CI support to the working groups, so helping them adopt that where those resources are available. Again, because that puts everyone on the same even field in terms of understanding the actual development process and automation that we have around the technical assets. And of course, where we see opportunities for new contributors, really cultivating them and helping them get into the community. So if you want to get involved, I think some great next steps are to look at the community. We've hopefully have a much more coherent organization that's more comprehensible. So understand where you might want to be contributing, either because you're interested in that project on your own or because your employer is paying you to invest in that area. And also keep in mind that we're not just looking at code contributions. If you're doing things like making proposals or reviewing discussions on Slack or those proposals, or even reviewing PRs from other people, those all count as contributions. And so if you want to look at the exact criteria to advance to any of these community roles, that's encoded in the community repo. So if you look at that rules document that Greg mentioned earlier, that's really the source of truth for that information. And of course, then get involved in the public discussions in the area where you want to contribute. Understand what's going on and how you can be contributing, getting started in that area. And especially ask for good first issues, ask to get reviews of PRs that you're sending in. The working group should be doing that, but they might need a reminder to be inclusive and to make sure that everyone is able to contribute here. Of course, even small scale things like little docs improvements, whether that's to the actual documentation site or to the docs around a repository or addressing some minor tech data, those are great ways to get familiar with the code base, get familiar with the project, really build your credibility and understand what's going on in that area. So again, I'm really optimistic about a lot of the changes that we've been making over the past year. I've been seeing the community get a lot healthier over the last year. And I really want to thank everyone for coming out to this first in-person event in the past 2.5 years. And again, being willing to participate in what's been a really positive and enjoyable community, certainly from my perspective. So thank you. Are there any questions? Yeah. Yeah, so the question is about, if we have some dispute in the community around the administration of the processes, there are shortcuts or mechanisms. I think at this point, we're a small enough and understanding enough community that we can make exceptions to things. And where we generally want to be automating things, we prefer that. But if there are some manual steps that we need to do to unblock people, then that's totally fine. We just want to make sure that we're able to keep track of those and to be able to reverse those or to recreate them if necessary, just so that we don't have a snowflake configuration within the community.